They banished the old widow from the ranch, but she held the secret to a $10 million gold mine. You're about to discover one of the most shocking stories of greed, betrayal, and ultimate justice from the American frontier. A tale that will show you how a cruel family's decision to cast out an elderly widow led to the revelation of one of the richest gold discoveries in Western history. If you're ready to witness how karma delivered the most spectacular revenge, and how a forgotten woman held the key to unimaginable wealth, make sure to smash that like button right now, subscribe to our channel for more incredible frontier stories, and ring that notification bell so you never miss these amazing tales of justice and redemption from the untamed West. Now let's journey back to 1892 in the rugged mountains of Colorado Territory, where 72-year-old Eleanor Nora McKinnon was about to be thrown out of the only home she had known for 40 years, completely unaware that she possessed knowledge worth more than the entire state's annual budget. The bitter Colorado wind howled through the gaps in the weathered log walls of the McKinnon ranch house, carrying with it the promise of an early winter and the scent of snow from the high peaks that surrounded the valley. Inside the large main room, a scene of family betrayal was unfolding that would have consequences reaching far beyond anything the participants could possibly imagine. Eleanor McKinnon sat rigidly upright in the worn wooden chair that had been her late husband's favorite, her weathered hands folded in her lap and her steel-gray eyes fixed on the faces of the people she had considered family for most of her adult life. At 72 years old, Nora McKinnon was a woman who had survived 4 decades of frontier hardship, raised 6 children to adulthood, and worked alongside her husband Patrick to build the McKinnon Ranch from a wilderness homestead into one of the most prosperous cattle operations in the Colorado Territory. Now, just 18 months after Patrick's death from a heart attack that had claimed him suddenly while working with the cattle, Nora found herself facing the unthinkable. Her own stepson and his wife were demanding that she leave the ranch immediately, claiming that her continued presence was an impediment to their plans for modernizing and expanding the operation. James McKinnon, Patrick's eldest son from his first marriage, stood near the stone fireplace with his arms crossed and his expression set in lines of cold determination. At 45 years old, James had inherited his father's imposing physical presence, but none of his warmth or sense of family loyalty. Beside him stood his wife, Margaret, a woman 15 years younger than her husband, who had arrived at the ranch 3 years earlier with social ambitions that far exceeded the possibilities offered by frontier life in a remote Colorado valley. Margaret McKinnon was a woman who had grown up in the relative comfort of Denver society and had never fully accepted the isolation and hard work that characterized life on a working ranch. She had married James partly out of genuine affection, but primarily because she believed that his inheritance of the family property would provide her with the social status and financial security she craved. The continued presence of Patrick's widow, however, represented an obstacle to her plans for transforming the ranch into something more suited to her vision of genteel living. "Nora," James said, his voice carrying the forced patience of a man who had already made his decision and was merely going through the motions of explanation, "you must understand that Margaret and I need to make significant changes to the way this ranch operates. The old ways that you and Pa used aren't suitable for the modern world we're entering." The statement was both insulting and historically inaccurate, as Eleanor McKinnon possessed more practical knowledge about ranch management than anyone else in the territory, including her stepson. She had been Patrick's full partner in every aspect of building their operation, from selecting breeding stock to negotiating contracts with cattle buyers. Her understanding of the land, the animals, and the complex web of relationships that made frontier ranching successful was encyclopedic and had been earned through decades of direct experience. Margaret McKinnon stepped forward with the kind of false sympathy that women of her social class often employed when delivering unwelcome news. Mother McKinnon, we're not asking you to leave because we don't care about you. It's simply that James and I need to start our own family tradition, and having you here makes that more difficult for everyone involved." The use of the title Mother McKinnon was particularly galling, as Margaret had never shown Eleanor the respect or affection that the term implied. From the beginning of her marriage to James, Margaret had made it clear that she viewed her husband's stepmother as an unwelcome reminder of a previous era that needed to be swept away in favor of more modern and sophisticated approaches to frontier living. Eleanor listened to these explanations with the patience that came from 7 decades of dealing with difficult people and challenging situations. But her mind was working furiously to understand the real motivations behind this sudden demand for her departure. James had never shown particular ambition or innovation during the years when his father was alive, and Margaret's interest in ranch management had been minimal at best. The sudden urgency to modernize and expand seemed to have more to do with getting Eleanor out of the house than with any genuine vision for improving the operation. "James," Eleanor said quietly, her voice carrying the authority that came from years of making important decisions and seeing their consequences. "This ranch has been my home for 40 years. Your father and I built it together from nothing, and I know every aspect of its operation better than anyone. What exactly are these modernizations that require my absence?" James and Margaret exchanged a glance that revealed more than they intended about their real motivations. The truth was that they had been approached by railroad representatives who were interested in acquiring sections of the ranch property for a new line that would connect the mining towns in the high country with the transportation networks that served Denver and other major cities. The potential profit from such a sale was enormous, but it required clear ownership of the property without complications from competing claims or family obligations. Under Patrick's will, Eleanor had been granted lifetime residency rights to the ranch house and a share of the ranch's profits, provisions that were generous but also legally complex. The railroad representatives had made it clear that they preferred to deal with a single owner who could make decisions quickly and without consultation with other family members. James and Margaret had concluded that the simplest solution was to pressure Eleanor into leaving voluntarily, which would effectively eliminate her claims and simplify any future property transactions. "The specific details aren't important right now," James replied evasively. "What matters is that Margaret and I have decided to take the ranch in a new direction, and we need the freedom to make changes without having to consult with anyone else about our decisions." This statement revealed the fundamental dishonesty of their position, as Patrick's will had not granted James complete control over the ranch operations. Eleanor retained significant legal rights and responsibilities, and any major changes to the property or its management required her consent. By demanding that she leave, James and Margaret were essentially asking her to abandon her legal interests in favor of their unexplained plans. Eleanor had not survived 40 years of frontier life by being naive about human nature or blind to the signs of deception and greed. She recognized immediately that James and Margaret were hiding their true intentions, and she suspected that their sudden urgency had something to do with outside financial opportunities that they were unwilling to discuss openly. "I see," Eleanor said, with the kind of calm dignity that often preceded major confrontations. "And what provisions have you made for my support if I'm to leave the only home I've known for 4 decades? Your father's will granted me lifetime residency specifically because he knew I had nowhere else to go and no other means of support." Margaret McKinnon's response revealed both her callousness and her fundamental misunderstanding of frontier social relationships. "Mother McKinnon, surely a woman of your resourcefulness can find some kind of arrangement. Perhaps one of the other family members would be willing to take you in, or you could find a position as a housekeeper in one of the towns." The suggestion that a 72-year-old woman should seek employment as a domestic servant was so insulting that it left Eleanor momentarily speechless. Margaret's words revealed not only her lack of respect for her husband's stepmother, but also her complete ignorance of the economic realities faced by elderly women on the frontier. The idea that Eleanor could simply find alternative housing and employment at her age demonstrated a level of social blindness that was breathtaking in its scope. James, perhaps sensing that his wife had gone too far, attempted to soften the blow with his own version of false concern. "Nora, we're not trying to abandon you. We're prepared to provide a small monthly allowance that should help you find suitable accommodations elsewhere. It's just that this house is too big for 3 adults, and Margaret needs room to establish her own household routines." The offer of a small monthly allowance was particularly insulting, as Eleanor's legal share of the ranch profits amounted to far more than whatever pittance James was prepared to offer in exchange for her voluntary departure. The attempt to frame her removal as a space issue was equally dishonest, as the ranch house contained more than enough room for multiple families. Having been designed by Patrick and Eleanor specifically to accommodate their large family during the years when all 6 children had lived at home, Eleanor rose from her chair with the dignity of a woman who had made important decisions throughout her life and was preparing to make another one. Her 72 years had taught her to recognize when negotiation was pointless and when action was required, and she understood that James and Margaret had already decided to pursue their course regardless of her wishes or legal rights. "I understand," she said with quiet firmness, "that you've made up your minds about this matter and that further discussion would be pointless. I'll need some time to make arrangements, but I won't remain where I'm not wanted." The ease with which Eleanor accepted their ultimatum seemed to surprise both James and Margaret, who had apparently expected more resistance or emotional pleading. They had underestimated the strength of character that had enabled Eleanor to survive and thrive during 4 decades of frontier life, and they failed to recognize that her calm acceptance might indicate planning rather than defeat. "We appreciate your understanding," Margaret said with obvious relief, "and we want you to know that this isn't personal. It's simply a matter of practical necessity." Eleanor nodded politely, but said nothing more, having learned long ago that some people were immune to shame and that pointing out their moral failures was a waste of time and energy. Instead, she excused herself from the conversation and retired to the bedroom she had shared with Patrick, where she began the process of considering her options and making plans for an uncertain future. As she sat on the edge of the bed she had shared with her husband for 40 years, Eleanor allowed herself a few moments of grief and anger at the betrayal she was experiencing. Patrick had trusted his son to honor the provisions he had made for Eleanor's security, and he would have been devastated to learn that James was prepared to cast aside his stepmother in pursuit of unspecified financial opportunities. But Eleanor McKinnon was not a woman who indulged in extended self-pity or helpless despair. She had survived the death of 2 children from childhood diseases, several years of drought that had nearly destroyed their cattle operation, and the countless other challenges that characterized frontier life. The betrayal by her stepson and his wife was painful, but it was not insurmountable. As she began to pack her personal belongings, Eleanor's mind turned to practical matters and to the knowledge she possessed that James and Margaret knew nothing about. During their 40 years of marriage, Patrick had shared with her information that he had never disclosed to his children, secrets about the ranch property that could have enormous implications for anyone who understood their significance. The McKinnon Ranch encompassed nearly 10,000 acres of some of the most beautiful and strategically located land in Colorado Territory. The property included river frontage, high mountain meadows, perfect for summer grazing, and most importantly, mineral rights that Patrick had acquired through careful negotiation and legal maneuvering during the early days of territorial development. But the most significant secret that Eleanor possessed concerned a discovery that Patrick had made just 3 months before his death. A discovery that he had shared only with his wife because he had not yet decided how to proceed with the information. During a routine inspection of the property's remote eastern boundary, Patrick had discovered clear evidence of gold deposits that appeared to be both extensive and extraordinarily rich. The discovery had occurred in a narrow canyon that was difficult to access and rarely visited by anyone other than Patrick himself during his periodic boundary surveys. The gold-bearing quartz veins were visible in the canyon walls, and Patrick's limited testing had suggested that the deposits were of unusual size and quality. He had estimated that proper development of the site could yield millions of dollars in gold. But he had also understood that such development would transform their quiet ranch into a center of mining activity that would change everything about their way of life. Patrick had died before making any decisions about how to proceed with his discovery, and Eleanor had kept the secret even from her stepchildren because she hadn't been certain of how the knowledge might affect the family dynamics that were already complicated by questions of inheritance and property rights. Now, as she faced eviction from her own home, Eleanor realized that her knowledge of the gold deposits gave her options that James and Margaret could never have imagined. The irony of the situation was almost amusing. James and Margaret were forcing her to leave the property in pursuit of some railroad deal that might provide them with tens of thousands of dollars, completely unaware that they were giving up access to deposits worth millions. Their greed and callousness were about to cost them a fortune that would have secured not only their future, but the futures of generations of McKinnons yet to be born. Over the following days, Eleanor made her preparations to leave the ranch while carefully observing James and Margaret's activities and trying to understand the nature of their mysterious plans. She noticed increased activity among strangers who visited the property, men in city clothes who spent time surveying the land and making notes in official-looking documents. She also observed that James had begun making inquiries about property values and legal procedures for transferring ownership rights. The pattern of activity confirmed Eleanor's suspicions that James and Margaret were planning to sell some or all of the ranch property to outside interests, probably the railroad representatives who were known to be active in the area. The financial motivation for their demand that she leave was becoming clearer, even as the moral bankruptcy of their behavior became more obvious. Eleanor's preparations for departure were methodical and deliberate, reflecting both her practical nature and her awareness that she needed to protect her own interests in a situation where she could trust no one else to do so. She arranged for transportation to the nearest town, where she planned to take temporary lodging while making longer-term plans for her future. She also made discreet inquiries about legal representation, understanding that she might need professional help to protect her rights under Patrick's will. Most importantly, Eleanor spent considerable time in the remote eastern section of the ranch, ostensibly saying goodbye to places that held special memories, but actually conducting her own survey of the gold deposits that Patrick had discovered. Using knowledge gained from 40 years of frontier living and from conversations with miners and prospectors who had visited the ranch over the years, Eleanor was able to confirm Patrick's assessment of the deposit's potential value. The gold-bearing quartz veins were indeed extensive and appeared to be of exceptional quality, running through a series of interconnected canyon systems that could support major mining operations. Eleanor's rough calculations suggested that proper development of the site could yield anywhere from $10 to $50 million in gold, depending on the actual extent and richness of the deposits. Armed with this knowledge, Eleanor made a decision that would ultimately transform her from a discarded widow into one of the wealthiest women in Colorado Territory. Instead of simply accepting James and Margaret's ultimatum and fading quietly into obscurity, She decided to use her secret knowledge to secure her own future while teaching her ungrateful step-family a lesson they would never forget. The first step in Eleanor's plan was to establish her legal rights to the mineral deposits on the ranch property. Patrick's will had granted her specific rights to the ranch's resources, including any minerals that might be discovered. But those rights needed to be formally documented and protected before James and Margaret could interfere with them. Eleanor arranged to meet with a lawyer in Denver who specialized in mining law and property rights, taking with her copies of Patrick's will and detailed information about the gold deposits. The lawyer, Marcus Whitfield, was a man in his 60s who had built his career on understanding the complex legal framework that governed mineral rights in the Western Territories. After reviewing Eleanor's documents and listening to her description of the gold deposits, Whitfield confirmed that her legal position was stronger than she had dared to hope. "Mrs. McKinnon," Whitfield said with evident excitement, "your husband's will is very carefully written, and it grants you clear rights to any mineral discoveries on the property. More importantly, Colorado territorial law recognizes your claim regardless of what your stepson might prefer. If these deposits are as valuable as you believe, you're looking at one of the most significant mining discoveries in the territory's history." Whitfield went on to explain the legal procedures for establishing formal mining claims and the steps required to protect Eleanor's interests from any interference by James or Margaret. The process was complex but straightforward, requiring official surveys, proper documentation with territorial authorities, and compliance with various regulations governing mineral extraction rights. "The beauty of your situation," Whitfield continued, "is that your stepson appears to be unaware of the deposit's existence. This gives you time to establish your legal claims before anyone can challenge them. Once your rights are properly documented, there's nothing your stepson can do to prevent you from developing the mining operation or selling your rights to professional mining companies." Eleanor left the lawyer's office with a detailed plan for securing her rights to the gold deposits, and with a profound sense of satisfaction at the justice that was about to be served. James and Margaret's greed was about to cost them not only the moral respect of their community, but also a fortune that would have secured their family's future for generations. The next phase of Eleanor's plan required considerable courage and careful timing, as she needed to complete the legal procedures for establishing her mining claims without alerting James and Margaret to what she was doing. This meant conducting surveys and filing documentation while officially preparing to leave the ranch as they had demanded. Eleanor hired a discreet surveyor who was experienced in mining claims and who understood the need for confidentiality in her situation. The survey work was conducted during times when James and Margaret were occupied with their own mysterious activities, and the results confirmed everything that Eleanor had hoped. The gold deposits were indeed extensive and extraordinarily rich, with potential yields that exceeded even her most optimistic estimates. The formal mining claims were filed with territorial authorities under Eleanor's name, with documentation that clearly established her legal rights to the mineral deposits on the eastern section of the McKinnon Ranch. The paperwork was processed quietly and efficiently, with no publicity that might have alerted James and Margaret to what was happening. While Eleanor was securing her mining rights, James and Margaret were finalizing their own plans for the ranch property. Their negotiations with the railroad representatives had progressed to the point where contracts were being prepared for the sale of significant portions of the ranch, including most of the grazing land that had provided the family's income for 4 decades. The irony of the situation was extraordinary. James and Margaret were preparing to sell the ranch's surface rights for what they considered a fortune, completely unaware that Eleanor had just secured mining rights worth many times more than their railroad contracts. Their cruel treatment of Patrick's widow was about to cost them one of the richest gold discoveries in American history. On the day before Eleanor's planned departure from the ranch, she made one final visit to the remote canyon where Patrick had discovered the gold deposits. Standing in the narrow defile, where millions of dollars worth of gold lay waiting to be extracted, Eleanor allowed herself a moment of profound satisfaction at the justice that was about to be served. She also took a moment to speak to Patrick's memory, sharing with him the news of what she had discovered and how she planned to use their secret to secure her own future. "Patrick, my dear," she said aloud to the wind that whispered through the canyon walls, "your son has shown his true character, but your wife is about to show hers. These deposits will provide for me better than any step-family ever could, and they'll serve as a monument to the man who discovered them." Eleanor's actual departure from the McKinnon Ranch was conducted with the same dignity that had characterized her response to James and Margaret's ultimatum. She packed her belongings, arranged for transportation to town, and said goodbye to the home she had shared with Patrick for 40 years without revealing any hint of the plans she had set in motion. James and Margaret watched her leave with obvious relief, apparently believing that they had successfully eliminated the primary obstacle to their railroad negotiations. They had no idea that the elderly woman they were casting aside possessed knowledge that made their entire scheme seem petty and short-sighted by comparison. Eleanor took up temporary residence in a modest boarding house in the nearby town of Cedar Falls, where she presented herself as a widow who was adjusting to life without her husband and making plans for her future. Her quiet demeanor and apparent acceptance of her circumstances convinced the local residents that she was exactly what she appeared to be, an elderly woman who had been displaced by family circumstances and was making the best of a difficult situation. In reality, Eleanor was using her time in Cedar Falls to finalize the arrangements for developing her mining claims and to negotiate with professional mining companies that had the expertise and resources to extract the gold efficiently. The negotiations were complex and required careful attention to legal details, but they ultimately resulted in agreements that would provide Eleanor with both immediate payments and long-term royalties that would make her one of the wealthiest individuals in Colorado Territory. The mining company that Eleanor selected, Rocky Mountain Mining and Development, was one of the most reputable and successful operations in the region. The company's representatives were initially skeptical of claims made by an elderly widow, but their professional surveys of the gold deposits quickly confirmed that Eleanor's estimates had been, if anything, conservative. The deposits were not only extensive and rich, but also accessible in ways that would make extraction relatively straightforward and profitable. "Mrs. McKinnon," said Charles Morrison, Rocky Mountain Mining's chief engineer, "I've been evaluating mineral claims for 20 years, and I've never seen anything to compare with what you've discovered. These deposits could yield anywhere from $10 to $20 million in gold, possibly more if the veins extend as far as our preliminary surveys suggest." Noti, the financial arrangements that Eleanor negotiated with Rocky Mountain Mining were structured to provide her with immediate security and long-term wealth, while also ensuring that the mining operations would be conducted in ways that respected the environmental and social impact on the surrounding community. Eleanor received an immediate payment of $100,000 for the rights to begin development, along with agreements for ongoing royalties that would provide her with substantial income for the rest of her life. While Eleanor was finalizing her mining agreements, James and Margaret were completing their own negotiations with the railroad representatives. Their contracts called for the sale of approximately half the ranch's acreage for the sum of $75,000, an amount that they considered a tremendous windfall that would enable them to modernize their remaining operations and establish themselves as prosperous members of Colorado's emerging business community. The timing of the two sets of negotiations was such that James and Margaret signed their railroad contracts on the same day that Eleanor's mining agreements became legally binding. Neither party was aware of the other's activities, But the contrast between their respective deals was stark. James and Margaret were selling land for thousands of dollars, while Eleanor was securing rights worth millions. The first indication that something had changed in the balance of power came when Rocky Mountain Mining began the preliminary work needed to establish their mining operations on the eastern section of the McKinnon Ranch. The activity required access roads, equipment transportation, and the beginning of actual excavation work, all of which was visible from the main ranch house where James and Margaret were celebrating their railroad windfall. James McKinnon's first reaction to the mining activity was confusion rather than alarm, as he assumed that some neighboring property owner had discovered mineral deposits and was beginning development work. It wasn't until he investigated more closely that he discovered the shocking truth. The mining operations were taking place on his own property, and they were being conducted under legal claims filed by his stepmother, Eleanor. The discovery hit James like a physical blow, as he realized that the woman he had cast aside as a useless burden possessed mining rights that made his railroad contracts look like pocket change. His immediate reaction was to contact his lawyer and demand that Eleanor's mining claims be challenged on the grounds that she had no right to make such agreements without consulting the property's primary owner. The lawyer's response was devastating to James's hopes of challenging Eleanor's position. "Mr. McKinnon, I've reviewed your father's will and the territorial laws governing mineral rights, and I'm afraid your stepmother's position is unassailable. She has clear legal authority to file mining claims on the property, and her agreements with Rocky Mountain Mining are completely valid. There's nothing you can do to prevent or interfere with their operations." The lawyer went on to explain the full implications of Eleanor's mining claims, including the estimated value of the gold deposits and the likelihood that her royalty agreements would generate millions of dollars in income over the coming years. The irony of the situation was not lost on anyone involved. James had forced Eleanor to leave the ranch in pursuit of a relatively modest railroad deal, only to discover that she had secured mining rights worth 100 times more than his contracts. Margaret McKinnon's reaction to the news was even more extreme than her husband's, as she realized that her dreams of social advancement and financial security had been destroyed by her own cruelty toward Eleanor. The woman she had dismissed as an impediment to their plans had outsmarted them so completely that the comparison was almost humiliating. "How could she have known about the gold?" Margaret demanded, as if Eleanor's superior knowledge was somehow unfair or illegitimate. "She's just an old woman who never left the ranch." James's answer revealed his own recognition of how badly he had underestimated his stepmother. "She lived here for 40 years and knew every inch of this property better than anyone. Pa must have told her things that he never shared with the rest of us." As word of Eleanor's mining success spread throughout the region, the reactions from the local community were overwhelmingly supportive of the widow who had been so callously treated by her stepfamily. The story of how James and Margaret had evicted Eleanor from her own home, only to discover that she possessed knowledge worth millions, became a local legend that was told and retold as an example of how justice sometimes prevails over greed and cruelty. The contrast between Eleanor's dignified behavior and James and Margaret's obvious bitterness about their own poor judgment made the community's choice of sides even easier. Eleanor was seen as a victim who had triumphed through her own intelligence and strength, while James and Margaret were viewed as greedy relatives who had gotten exactly what they deserved. The mining operations on Eleanor's claims proceeded rapidly and successfully, with Rocky Mountain Mining confirming that the gold deposits were even richer than initial surveys had suggested. The company's extraction techniques were efficient and environmentally responsible, and the profits generated by the operations quickly established Eleanor as one of the wealthiest individuals in Colorado Territory. Eleanor used her newfound wealth in ways that reflected both her practical nature and her sense of justice. She purchased a beautiful home in Denver, where she could enjoy the cultural amenities of city life while maintaining connections to the frontier community that had been her home for so many years. She also established a trust fund to provide assistance to elderly widows who faced circumstances similar to those she had experienced, ensuring that other women would not have to endure the kind of abandonment she had suffered. Most satisfying of all, Eleanor used a portion of her wealth to purchase the mortgage on the McKinnon Ranch, which James and Margaret had been forced to refinance in order to cover their expenses, after realizing how badly they had miscalculated their financial situation. This purchase gave Eleanor legal leverage over the property that her stepfamily could not ignore or circumvent. The first time James and Margaret learned of Eleanor's ownership of their mortgage was when they received an official notice that their property was now subject to new terms and conditions that reflected Eleanor's interests as their creditor. The psychological impact of this reversal was profound, as they realized that the woman they had cast aside now held their financial future in her hands. Eleanor's handling of her power over James and Margaret was characteristically thoughtful and just. She did not use her position to seek revenge or to make their lives unnecessarily difficult, but she did establish conditions that required them to treat ranch employees and community members with the respect and fairness that they had failed to show her. "James," Eleanor said during their first meeting after the mortgage transfer, "I don't wish to see you and Margaret lose your home, but I do expect you to understand that actions have consequences. You chose to cast aside the woman who helped build this ranch, and you must live with the results of that choice." The conversation that followed was one of the most difficult of James McKinnon's life, as he was forced to confront not only his financial dependence on the woman he had wronged, but also his recognition of the moral failure that his treatment of Eleanor had represented. Margaret's presence during the meeting only emphasized the extent to which their greed and social ambitions had led them into a situation that was both financially and morally untenable. "Nora," James said with obvious difficulty, "I know that what we did was wrong, and I'm sorry for the way we treated you. Margaret and I were thinking only of our own plans and didn't consider how our actions would affect you." Eleanor accepted the apology with the same dignity that had characterized her response to their original ultimatum, but she made it clear that forgiveness would not mean forgetting the lessons that the situation had taught about character and consequences. "James, I appreciate your words, but I think we all understand that apologies cannot undo the damage that has been done. You and Margaret made choices based on greed and prejudice, and those choices have shaped the relationship we will have going forward." The ongoing relationship between Eleanor and her stepfamily was complicated, but ultimately sustainable, as all parties learned to navigate the new realities created by Eleanor's wealth and power. James and Margaret remained on the ranch property, but under conditions that required them to demonstrate the kind of respect for others that should have characterized their behavior from the beginning. Eleanor's mining operations continued to generate enormous profits, with Rocky Mountain Mining estimating that the total value of the gold deposits would ultimately exceed $15 million. The success of the mining venture attracted national attention, with newspapers and magazines featuring stories about the elderly widow, whose knowledge of a secret gold mine had transformed her from a discarded family member into one of the richest women in America. The publicity surrounding Eleanor's story also attracted the attention of women's rights advocates, who saw her triumph as an example of how women could overcome social and economic discrimination through their own intelligence and determination. Eleanor became a symbol of female empowerment and independence, proving that age and social status were no barriers to success for women who possessed the courage and knowledge to seize their opportunities. As the years passed, Eleanor's wealth continued to grow, but she remained grounded in the values and relationships that had sustained her during her 40 years as a ranch wife. She maintained her connections to the frontier community, supporting local businesses and institutions, while using her resources to improve educational and social services in the region. She also continued to live modestly despite her enormous wealth, understanding that true security came not from accumulating money, but from maintaining the relationships and principles that provided life with meaning and purpose. Her charitable work expanded to include support for mining safety initiatives, environmental protection efforts, and programs to assist elderly women throughout the Western Territories. The McKinnon Ranch continued to operate under James and Margaret's management, but with a level of community oversight that reflected Eleanor's interests in ensuring fair treatment for workers and responsible stewardship of the land. The property became a model for how mining and ranching operations could coexist in ways that benefited both the environment and the local economy. Eleanor's relationships with her other stepchildren, who had not been involved in James and Margaret's scheme to evict her, remained strong and supportive. These family members had been horrified to learn of their brother's behavior and had gone out of their way to maintain connections with Eleanor that honored both her role in their father's life and her own remarkable achievements. The legal and financial structures that Eleanor established to manage her wealth were designed to ensure that her resources would continue to benefit worthy causes long after her own death. She created a foundation focused on supporting elderly women, educational initiatives, and environmental protection, with management responsibilities distributed among trustees who shared her values and vision. As Eleanor entered her 80s, she could look back on her life with profound satisfaction at the justice that had been served and the good that had been accomplished through her trials and triumphs. The woman who had been cast aside as a useless burden had not only survived, but had thrived in ways that exceeded anything she could have imagined during her darkest moments. The story of Eleanor McKinnon became a legend throughout the American West, told and retold as an example of how wisdom, courage, and moral strength could triumph over greed, prejudice, and cruelty. At its heart remained the simple truth that she had discovered through her ordeal, that real wealth comes not from what others give us, but from what we know, what we do, and how we treat those who depend on our kindness and justice. When Eleanor died peacefully at the age of 86, her funeral was attended by hundreds of people whose lives she had touched through her generosity and example. The eulogy delivered by the minister who had known her longest captured the essence of her remarkable journey. Eleanor McKinnon taught us that sometimes what appears to be the end is actually the beginning, and that the knowledge and strength we carry within us are worth more than all the gold in the mountains. The headstone placed on Eleanor's grave bore a simple inscription that captured the essence of her extraordinary life. Eleanor McKinnon, 1820–1906. She turned betrayal into triumph and proved that wisdom is the greatest treasure of all. If this incredible story of justice, wisdom, and the ultimate triumph of character over greed has inspired you as much as it has inspired me, please take a moment to like this video and share it with others who need to be reminded that real strength comes from knowledge, dignity, and the courage to stand up for what's right. Subscribe to our channel for more amazing stories from America's frontier and hit that notification bell so you never miss these tales of ordinary people who accomplished extraordinary things through their own determination and moral courage. Remember that each of us possesses knowledge and strength that others might underestimate, and that sometimes our greatest challenges become our greatest opportunities for triumph. Until next time, may we all have the wisdom to recognize the true value of what we possess and the courage to use it when justice demands action.